Dear viewers, learning occupies a very important place in our life. Most of what we do or do not do is influenced by what we learn and how we learn it. Learning, therefore, provides a key to the structure of our personality and behavior. An individual starts learning immediately after his birth, or in a strict sense even earlier in the womb of the mother. Experience, direct or indirect, is found to play a dominant role in moulding and shaping the behavior of the individual from the very beginning. When he touches a burning matchstick, the child gets burnt, and the next time when he comes across a burning matchstick, he loses no time in withdrawing from it. He learns to avoid not only the burning matchstick, but also all burning things. When this happens, we say that the child has learnt that if one touches a flame, one gets burnt. In the same way, from some other experience, he may conclude, for instance, that green apples are sour, barking dogs seldom bite, a bird in hand is better than two in the bush, be very cautious in believing strangers. All these conclusions derived from experiences, direct or indirect, bring about a change in the behavior of the individual. These changes in behavior brought about by experience are commonly known as learning. In this way, the term learning, broadly speaking, stands for all those changes and modifications in the behavior of the individual which he undergoes during his lifetime. Now, let us see the meaning of learning. The knowledge we acquire, the language we speak, the habits, attitudes and the skills developed in us are all due to learning. Psychologists define learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior which occurs as a result of activity, training, practice or experience. This definition of learning has three important elements. Learning results in change in behavior. It is a change that takes place through practice or experience. Before it can be called learning, the change must be relatively permanent. It must last a fairly long time, but behavior changes brought about by fatigue, drugs, illness, warm up are transitory in nature, and hence they are not included under learning. Thus, learning could be defined more simply as profiting from experience. Now, let us see about learning theories. The versatility of man's adjustment to diverse environments and commanding heights achieved by him in arts, science, philosophy as well as his rich cultural accomplishments are all founded on his unparalleled learning capacity. Learning is said to occur whenever one adopts new behavior patterns or attitudes. Psychologists have observed different learning situations and studied the nature of the learning process. As learning is a complex phenomenon, different people view it differently, giving importance to one or the other aspect of learning process. Thus, psychologists hold different views on the intrinsic and basic nature of learning process, and each set of views attempting to explain learning process is came to be known as a theory of learning. Every theory of learning attempts to explain the following basic 6 questions pertaining to learning. What is learning or how one learns? What are the reasons for individual differences in learning? How one forgets? What is the role of practice in understanding in learning? How learning in one area is transferred to other areas? What are the ways of motivating people to learn? Now, let us see the classification of learning theories. These theories may be broadly classified under two major heads: connectionist or behavioristic theories and cognitive theories. Connectionist or behaviorist theories belong to the school of behaviorism. They interpret learning in terms of connection or association between stimulus and response. Under this category, we may include theories like Thorndike's theory of trial and error learning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, Guthrie's continuity theory of learning, and Hull's drive reduction theory of learning. Cognitive theories, on the other hand, belong to the school of Gestalt psychology and cognitive psychology. In place of purely mechanical or instrumental approach, these theories emphasize the role of purpose, insight, understanding, reasoning, memory, and cognitive factors in the process of learning. Under this category, theories like the theory of insightful learning, Levin's field theory of learning, and Tolman's sign learning may be included. Let us now discuss few of these behaviorist and cognitive theories of learning. First, Thorndike's theory of trial and error learning. Trial and error is a method of learning in which various responses are tentatively tried and some discarded until a solution is attained. E. L. Thorndike was the chief exponent of the theory of connectionism or trial and error. He was an American psychologist who conducted stimulus response theory experiment with the help of animals. Thorndike was the first to study the subject of learning systematically using standardized procedure and apparatus. All learning, according to Thorndike, is the formation of bonds or connections between stimulus and response. Let us now discuss about his famous puzzle box experiment. Thorndike's experiment on cat in the puzzle box is widely known and often quoted in psychology of learning. The experimental setup was very simple. A hungry cat was confined in a puzzle box, and outside the box a dish of food was kept. The cat in the box had to pull a string to come out of the box. The cat in the box made several random movements of jumping, dashing, and running to get out of the box. The cat at last succeeded in pulling the string. The door of the puzzle box opened, the cat came out and ate the food. He promptly put the cat to next trial. The cat again gave a lot of frantic behavior, but it soon succeeded in pulling the string. It repeated for several times. Thorndike noticed as the repetition increases, the error also reduced. That is, Thorndike's cat showed slow, gradual, and continuous improvement in performance over successive trials. He concluded that learning of cat in the puzzle box can be explained in terms of formation of direct connectionism between stimulus and response. Let us see the futures of trial and error learning. Learning by trial and error is a gradual process. For learning to occur, the learner must be definitely motivated. The learner makes random and variable response. Some responses do lead to the goal, that is called as annoying response. Some responses lead to the goal, that is called as satisfying responses. With the increase in number of trials, the annoying responses will tend to be eliminated and the satisfying responses will be strengthened and repeated. The time taken to perform the task, that is to repeat the satisfying response, decreases with successive trials. Now, let us see about Thorndike's laws of learning. Based on the findings obtained in his puzzle box experiment, Thorndike enunciated three primary laws of learning. They are law of readiness, law of exercise, and law of effect. Now, let us define law of readiness. When any conducting unit is ready to conduct, to allow it to do so is satisfying, not to allow it to do so is annoying. When any conducting unit is not ready to conduct, for it to conduct is annoying. This law is a law of preparatory adjustment and not a law about growth. The educational implications of the law are as follows. The teachers should see that the child is motivated to learn before he begins to teach. Motivation is the royal road to learning. Preparatory exercises that will hasten the state of readiness can be given. The teacher should introduce a lesson by relating it to the background experience of the child. Interest inventories and aptitude tests can also be administered to know the entry behavior of the learners, especially in admitting students for specialized courses. Let us define the second law, named as law of exercise. Any response to a situation will, other things being equal, be more strongly connected with the situation in proportion to the number of times it has been connected with that situation and to the average vigor and duration of the connection. The law has two subparts, namely the law of use and law of disuse. The law of use states that when a modifiable connection is made between a situation and response, that connection strength is increased if it is practiced. The law of disuse states that when a modifiable connection is not made between a situation and response during a length of time, that connection strength is decreased. This means any act that is not practiced for some time gradually decays. The educational implications of the law are as follows. After learning anything, adequate practice or drill should be undertaken to ensure that learning becomes stable and effective. Periodical review of learned material is necessary. Mere drill or exercise is not enough. Continuous feedback is also necessary. Bad habits can be eliminated through disuse, leading to atrophy or forgetting. The third law, namely the law of effect, states that when a modifiable connection between a stimulus and response is made and is accompanied or followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the strength of connection is increased. When a connection between stimulus and response is made and accompanied or followed by an annoying state of affairs, its strength decreases. As reward increases the learning behavior, judicious use of praise and encouragement in the class promotes better learning. As success leads to further success, school activities can be arranged in such a way that all learners may have some degree of success and confidence in their work. This means that all assignments should be so graded that everyone gets some success initially. The limitations of Thorndike's theory of trial and error. Thorndike's theory of trial and error is true only for motor learning, and that too for learning a complex task in an unfamiliar situation. All human learning does not take place at the physical level alone. Thorndike's theory reduces intelligence to the capacity to form yes/or bonds, that is, learning becomes mechanical and the cognitive skills like thinking, reasoning, comprehending, imagining have no relevance in learning. This may be true in animal learning. Human beings are unique for their intelligence and the use of their sharpened cognitive capacities. According to Thorndike, what fixes the correct pattern of activity is use, disuse and effect of the elements that through association go to make up the pattern of activity. But this is not true in the case of complex high order learning. A complex algebraic problem cannot be solved by repeatedly doing the problem without proper understanding. Now, let us see about classical conditioning. In 1904, Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov, during his experimental work of dog's digestive process, accidentally noticed the secretion of saliva in the dog on the sight of food or hearing the steps of the caretaker. Conditioning can be defined as a process in which a neutral stimulus, which is not associated with any specific natural response, on pairing with a natural stimulus acquires all the characteristics of natural stimulus. It is also called as type S conditioning. Let us now see about Pavlov's experiment. When we put food in the mouth of the dog salivates. This response on the part of the dog is natural and unfailing. Food is called the unconditional stimulus, represented by UCS, and the salivation by the dog is called unconditional response, UCR. Food is called UCS and salivation is called UCR because the response depends upon no special condition and it is unlearned and implies no preconditions. During his experimentation on dogs, he presented food a few seconds after ringing a bell. At first, the dog did not exhibit any specific response hearing the ringing bell. Sometimes it may turn round towards the direction of sound, raise the ears or indulge in barking but not salivate. But when it started taking food, it salivated. This showed that the bell is a neutral stimulus as it is not capable of eliciting any specific response. This is the first stage of the experiment. When the experiment of pairing the bell sound, that is the neutral stimulus, with the presentation of food, that is the natural stimulus, for about 15 days continuously, it was noticed that the dog started salivating even on hearing the bell sound, well ahead of seeing the food. Now, the bell sound has acquired the capability of eliciting a specific response, that is salivating for it. Now, it is said that the dog has been conditioned to the ringing bell. This phenomenon of making a neutral stimulus to elicit a specific response by continuously pairing it with natural stimulus is termed as conditioning. Symbolic representation of classical conditioning follows. Stage 1, that is before conditioning. Food, the unconditional stimulus, yields salivation, unconditioned response. The ringing of the bell, conditioned stimulus, gives no specific or unique response. Stage 2, the process of conditioning. Bell sound, conditioned stimulus, plus food, the unconditioned stimulus, gives salivation, a conditioned response. Stage 3, after conditioning, bell sound, the conditioned stimulus, gives salivation, the conditioned response. If CS, that is the sound of the bell, is not followed by UCS, that is food, for few days, it means there is no reinforcement. A stage comes when the dog stops to secrete saliva. This process is known as extinction. The classic example for conditioning is that people bring down wild pigeons, usually sitting on high towers, by employing domesticated and trained pigeons. Conditioning appears to be the simplest type of learning and the basis for further and more complex types of learning. Conditioning appears to be an important means of learning among animals and human beings too, particularly in childhood. Simple patterns of behavior, learning of words and their associated meanings, new emotional responses may all be satisfactorily explained using the concept of conditioning. Now, let us see the educational implications of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is used in language learning by associating words with pictures or meanings. It can be used to develop favorable attitude towards learning, teachers, subjects and the school. Developing good habits in children such as cleanliness, respect for elders, punctuality or through the use of conditioning. Breaking of bad habits and elimination of conditioned fear through the use of deconditioning process. Let us see its limitations. Complex area of learning involving generalization, abstraction, reasoning, understanding and problem solving cannot be explained by conditioning process. It can describe only those learnings related to emotional shaping and habit formation. Now, let us discuss about Skinner's operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a theory of behaviorism that focuses on changes in an individual's observable behaviors. In operant conditioning, new or continued behaviors are impacted by new or continued consequences. As the organism expresses a response or behavior pattern and through that tries to fetch the reward, this type of learning is also called as instrumental conditioning and type R conditioning. Almost half a century after Thorndike's first publication of the principles of operant conditioning and the law of effect, Skinner attempted to prove an extension to this theory that all behaviors are in some way a result of operant conditioning. Skinner theorized that if a behavior is followed by reinforcement, that behavior is more likely to be repeated, but if it is followed by some sort of aversive stimuli or punishment, it is less likely to be repeated. He also believed that this learned association could end or become extinct if the reinforcement or punishment was removed. Let us see the famous Skinner's experiment. Skinner's most famous research studies were simple reinforcement experiments conducted on lab rats and domestic pigeons, which demonstrated the most basic principles of operant conditioning. He conducted most of his research in a special cumulative recorder now referred to as a Skinner box, which was used to analyze the behavioral responses of his test subjects. In these boxes, he would present his subjects with positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement or aversive stimuli in various timing intervals or schedules that were designed to produce or inhibit specific target behaviors. In his first work with rats, Skinner would place the rats in a Skinner box with a lever attached to a feeding tube. Whenever a rat pressed the lever, food would be released. After the experience of multiple trials, the rats learned the association between the lever and the food and began to spend more of their time in the box procuring food than performing any other action. It was through this earlier work that Skinner started to understand that effects of behavioral contingencies on actions. He discovered that the rate of response as well as changes in response futures depended on what occurred after the behavior was performed, not before. Skinner named these actions operant behaviors because they operated on the environment to produce an outcome. The process by which one could arrange the contingencies of reinforcement responsible for producing a certain behavior then came to be called operant conditioning. To prove his idea that behaviorism was responsible for all actions, he later created a superstitious pigeon. He fed the pigeon on continuous intervals, say for every 15 seconds, and observed the pigeon's behavior. He found that the pigeon's actions would change depending on what it had been doing in the moments before the food was dispensed, regardless of the fact that those actions had nothing to do with the dispensing of food. In this way, he discerned that the pigeon had fabricated a causal relationship between its actions and the presentation of reward. It was this development of superstition that led Skinner to believe all behavior could be explained as a learned reaction to specific consequences. In his operant conditioning experiments, Skinner often used an approach called shaping. Instead of rewarding only the target or desired behavior, the process of shaping involves the reinforcement of successive approximations of the target behavior. Behavioral approximations are behaviors that over time grow increasingly closer to the actual desired response. Skinner believed that all behavior is predetermined by past and present events in the objective world. He did not include room in his research for ideas such as free will or individual choice. Instead, he posited that all behavior could be explained using learned physical aspects of the world, including life history and evolution. His work remains extremely influential in the fields of psychology, behaviorism and education. Let us now see the Skinner's contribution to education. Skinner's operant conditioning theory has found application in education in the following ways: individualization of instruction, program learning, teaching machines, computer assisted instructions have their basis in the Skinner's theory of reinforcement of selective process. behavior modification techniques, use of instructional objectives, performance contracting, learning for mastery and teacher effectiveness training. Let us now see about the Gestalt theory of insight learning. Gestalt is a German word, means whole, pattern or configuration. According to Gestalt psychology, the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. The parts do not have any meaning outside the whole. For example, when we analyze the following figure in terms of the components, it may appear to consist of a straight line, two dots and an arc, but when we perceive the picture globally, it immediately becomes meaningful by reminding us the picture of a human head. We organize the individual parts so as to form a meaningful pattern, and the whole conveys a new meaning. In this process, our past experience play a leading role. To understand or learn a task means to perceive the whole with the structure of its components and their functional relationship. Thus, learning, according to Gestalt psychologists, involves the reorganization of experience into systematic and meaningful pattern. Now, let us discuss about insight learning. Insight learning was first researched by Wolfgang Kohler. This theory of learning differs from the trial and error ideas that were proposed before it. The key aspect of insight learning is that it is achieved through cognitive processes rather than interactions with the outside world. There is no gradual shaping or trial and error involved. Instead, internal organizational processes cause new behavior. Sultan the chimpanzee and insight learning. Kohler's most famous study on insight learning involved Sultan the chimpanzee. Sultan was in a cage and was presented with a stick which he could use to pull a piece of fruit close enough to the cage so that he could pick it up. After Sultan had learned to use the stick to reach the fruit, Kohler moved the fruit out of range of the short stick. He then placed a longer stick within reach of the short stick. Initially, Sultan tried to reach the fruit with the short stick and failed. Eventually, however, Sultan learned to use the short stick to reach the long stick and then use the long stick to reach the fruit. Sultan was never conditioned to use one stick to reach another. Instead, it seemed as if Sultan had an epiphany. The internal process that led Sultan to use the sticks in this way is a basic example of insight. A basic assumption of stick behaviorism is that only behavior that can be seen may be studied, and that human behavior is determined by conditioning. Insight learning suggests that we learn not only by conditioning but also by cognitive processes that cannot be directly observed. Insight learning is a form of learning because, like other forms, it involves a change in behavior. However, it differs from other forms because the process is not observable. It can be hard to define because it is not behavioral, a characteristic that distinguishes it from most theories of learning throughout the history of psychology. Initially, it was thought that learning was the result of reproductive thinking. This means that an organism reproduces a response to a given problem from past experience. Insight learning, however, does not directly involve using past experiences to solve a problem. While past experiences may help the process, an insight or novel idea is necessary to solve the problem. Prior knowledge is of limited help in these situations. In humans, insight learning occurs whenever we suddenly see a problem in a new way, connect the problem to another relevant problem or solution, release past experiences that are blocking the solution, or see the problem in a larger, more coherent context. Let us now see the educational implications of insight learning. The greatest contribution of Gestalt psychology to education is the emphasis on meaning in education. The world of classroom in which the student finds himself is not a body of independent stimuli. There is organization and meaning, and the child reacts with understanding. History is not a set of dates and events. It is a logical sweep of events through space and time. Similarly, mathematics is not just a collection of unconnected formulas. There is organization and meaning in it. In the working of the problem, each step is related with the next. Thus, education is to equip an individual with meaningful subjective experiences so as to perceive the situations with more clarity. Let us see the stages involved in insightful learning. The first stage is called the preparation, that is sensing or survey of the problem. The second stage is called as the incubation, that is the period of apparently no action. The third stage is called as the insight or illumination, that is the solution that appears as flash. The final stage is called as the evaluation, that is verifying the utility of the solution. Let us see the factors that influence insight. Intelligence. The more intelligent the organism is, the greater will be the insight. Experience. Past experience helps insightful solution. Presentation of the problem. Initial effort. Initial efforts also develop insight. It may be called trial and error effort made by the learner. In summing up, learning is defined as a process that brings together personal and environmental experiences and influences for acquiring, enriching or modifying one's knowledge, skills, values, attitudes, behavior and worldviews. Learning theories develop hypotheses that describe how this process takes place. The scientific study of learning started in the earnest at the dawn of the 20th century. The major concepts and theories of learning include behaviorist theories, cognitive psychology, constructivism, social constructivism, experiential learning, multiple intelligence and situated learning theory and community of practice. In this lesson, we have discussed so far on the classification of learning theories, Thorndike's trial and error learning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning and Kohler's insight learning. Thank you.